Good evening. My name is Curtis Probst, Managing Director at the Rocky Mountain Institute. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's book launch. It's a real privilege for me to be here this evening. This evening we are celebrating the launch of a new book, Sustainability Policy, Hastening the Transition to a Cleaner Economy. If you're here for a different book launch, now would be a good time to gracefully exit. The esteemed authors of the book here tonight all hold important positions at Columbia. Steve Cohen is Executive Director of the Earth Institute and a Professor of Practice here at the School of International and Public Affairs. Bill Eimicke is Director of the Picker Center for Executive Education and also a Professor of Practice at the School of International and Public Affairs. And Alison Miller is Deputy Executive Director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Now, I'll tell you that sometimes academics get a bad rap. I've heard some people in industry say this refrain, which is those who can, do, and those who can't, teach. Now, I don't agree with that. Now, some of my friends in academia have a retort to that, which is those who can teach, and those who can't pursue less fulfilling professions. I can tell you we are very fortunate here tonight to have three people who can do, who can teach, and who have had very fulfilling professions before joining Columbia University. They're all truly exceptional, and I'm proud to have them as colleagues in the field of sustainability and as friends. As for this evening's agenda, I'm going to start with asking our authors a few questions about their new book. I want all of you to join in and also ask questions of Steve, Bill, and Alison. Then after we've had enough Q&A, we'll begin the reception and the actual book signing. So unless the organizers have any further comments, without further ado, let's get into the questions. First question for Steve Cohen.
2 points?
Yes, exactly.
10-point question.
Exactly. No lifelines. What is the goal of this book?
Oh, we wrote a book.
Yes, exactly.
To be serious, the goal of the book is to learn how to speak into a microphone. The goal of the book is actually when, about 5 years ago, we started a new master's program in sustainability management, sort of building on the curriculum in environmental science and policy here at SEPA. And I started to think about how do I combine the environment, which is one of my lifelong interests, with management, which is what I had been teaching at SEPA for a couple of decades, now 3 decades. And so I wrote a book called Sustainability Management, which focused on what goes on within organizations to make them more sustainable, to make them behave in a more environmentally responsible fashion. By sustainable, I mean paying attention to how much energy and water they used, how much material they used, what they did with the material, and the impact of their production and consumption on ecosystems. This is what I sometimes call the physical dimensions of sustainability, which are a management issue. How do I deal with that as a CEO of an organization? Just like I have to worry about my strategy, my information, my marketing, I have to worry about these physical issues. Okay. So as this went on for a while, and in conversations with my colleagues, Professor Eimicke and Alison Miller, it really became clear that government had a very important role in stimulating this transition to a sustainable economy. And so we started to work on all of these issues. What can government do at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level? And of course, what we did is we took an inventory of examples of best practices at the federal, state, and local level. Now, in the United States, since we don't have a federal government, it's been pretty hard to come up with some good examples, but there are other countries, and they're doing things. And really what's been magnificent is what we've been seeing at the local level. So this is a book to answer the question, what can government do to bring about sustainability? So we wrote the book because Bill and I, in particular, coming out of public administration, didn't want to ignore the fact that you needed a partnership between the public and private sector to make sustainability happen. The private sector is not going to do it on its own. The public sector can't do it without the private sector and without the public. It's got to be a true collaboration between the public and private sector.
Okay. Excellent job. So, next question. Over to Alison. What is sustainability policy and why do we need it? Why is it important?
So, as Steve has already mentioned, we identified a major role for the public sector in transitioning towards a sustainable economy. And in looking across all areas, all levels of government, we identified, 4 major areas of focus. And this is the tax system. So the government needs to incentivize through use of taxes and through other financial mechanisms like subsidies to encourage private investment in the sustainability field, and this has to come from government. The second is building infrastructure. So the government has had a traditional role in building infrastructure throughout the history of the country. It built the roads, airports, the major infrastructure of this country. And not only does the government need to continue that work and upgrade these systems, but it needs to build the infrastructure for the next century. So smart grids, high-speed rail, high-speed internet, the types of things that will encourage sustainability. We also think that the federal government, in particular, needs to have a role in measuring the sustainable economy. So this involves the private sector in that they are voluntarily reporting sustainability in a variety of methods, but there is no overall guide in determining what they should be measuring and how they should be measuring it, and we see that as a major role for the public sector. And so those are just some of the examples of kind of what the government can do. But these are things that the private sector, the nonprofit sector, just aren't suited to accomplish.
Great, thanks. So the topic of sustainability is very broad, and the book covers a wide range of sustainability policy initiatives. Much of the book, however, focuses on energy, specifically what can be done to encourage renewable energy. Why is energy so important, and what role should government play in encouraging renewable energy? And I'll ask Steve to start off, but all 3 of you can chime in if you like.
Okay, well, anybody who has ever heard me talk about sustainability or write about sustainability has heard me say that energy is the central issue. We are addicted to fossil fuels. In China, 70% of the energy comes from coal. So it's not only for climate change, which is enough of a problem, but you've got to get the stuff out of the ground, and that can involve things like deep sea oil drilling. Think about that, BP, mountaintop removal, fracking, a whole range of things that we might want to avoid. And the thing about fossil fuels, if you're addicted to something, you want to make sure you can keep getting at it, and fossil fuels are finite. Now, it's not that we're going to run out of it. They'll get too expensive before we run out of it. But the central issue for sustainability, every time you look at an environmental issue, whether it's water treatment or it's desalinization or it's any number or waste management, all of it requires energy. And if we don't get off of dirty energy, if we don't get off of fossil fuels, we're going to be in trouble. And so energy is the central issue. And the other thing that I need to add quickly is that I don't believe that the answer to moving to sustainable energy is to raise the price of fossil fuels, but in fact by using technology to lower the price of renewable energy. Because energy is unlike anything else we've ever had to regulate. It is so important, so central to economic life. It is a part of everything that we make and do. It is energy which has transformed agriculture and industry and transportation and just our daily lives. And we wouldn't be in this nicely lit room looking at this beautiful skyline if it wasn't for Thomas Edison. So we need to really understand that the central part of this is going to be energy. It's not the only part, but it's the central part.
Others?
I'm an optimist, so I always look at the glass as half full. And I think if I have an aspiration for this book, it would be that for sustainability, this would become the joy of cooking. It's not a book that you sit down, by the fire with a glass of wine and savor every page. But when you want to think of a solution, what could we possibly do to do better, you look through this book. And I think if you look at it, as I fortunately or unfortunately have done many times already, it gives you a good list of what's possible. And I think sometimes we look at now, particularly with falling fossil fuel prices, and say, yeah, we're never going to get anywhere. And Steve and I have known each other for a long time, and for almost the whole time that we've known each other, he's been saying, someday solar is going to be the answer. And I've always believed him. And there was a day in May of last year where, in Germany, 75% of the energy used in the entire country of Germany was renewable, and the biggest component was solar. So that's not 20 years from now. And Germany is moving very rapidly. Their plan, and a lot of this for me is about management. It's not about discovery. It's how we manage our societies. Their goal is by 2050, 80% of their energy on an ongoing basis, not on a day at a time, will be renewable. And they're well on the way. So if you really want to be encouraged and look for answers, I think look through this book and see some of the stories. What's happening in Germany with renewables? What's happening in China with high-speed rail and public transportation? They have one of the worst traffic problems in the world, but they have high-speed rail that, for someone like me, just makes you envious. And you can't help, I think, for me, but to say, we could do that. I mean, we could do that. This is not Kennedy's let's go to the moon in 10 years. All the answers are already here. They're already in practice. It's just having, I think, the leadership, the guts. And I'll just say one last thing, which also, I was struck years ago, Steve actually mentions it in the book, when we had a period at the federal level very similar to the one we've had recently during the Reagan years. And David Osborne, any of you have read Reinventing Government, one of the best books written on government ever. His first popular book was called Laboratories of Democracy. And he wrote it about the fact that nothing was happening at the federal level, but if you looked around the country at the states, you saw all sorts of great ideas, including a guy named Bill Clinton, who was doing innovation in education. And again, I think if you look at the book, you'll see there is a lot going on the state, and now particularly at the local level, to do the kinds of things that we can and should and will do nationally. So I'm very optimistic.
Good. I have a long list of questions, but they've probably prepared answers for most of them. So rather than just go through that, I'd like to open it up to the floor to ask a few questions, and then if things slow down, I've got a few more to fire away. In the front. Oh, could we wait for a microphone to come by first?
Thank you. And thank you for taking my question. To my recollection, the U.S. is signatory to the UN's Global 2000, and that's a population reduction agenda. So how is that administered in the U.S.? I mean, did we get amendments to it or something? To my recollection also, I think the way Global 2000 is actually what sustainability is. So whereas I'm assuming other countries that are signatories to that are administering population reduction in one way or another. I'm not exactly certain what that looks like, but what are we doing in the U.S.?
Okay. Well, we don't write about this in the book, so it's not part of our agenda. But population has been increasing. When I was growing up, there were 3 billion people on the planet. Now there's 7 billion. But it is actually peaking and is actually being reversed in some places. The United States is one of these places. Japan is another. If it wasn't for immigration, we would be losing population. And the reason for that, which, again, if you've taken Sustainability Manager from me, you've heard me tell this story, is that children used to be an economic asset. They worked the farm. They were your Social Security. Now, what happens with economic development is there's a demographic.
Personally now.
There's a demographic transition where children ceased to be an economic asset, and they are what sociologists call decorative. Now, I have 2 daughters. I love them very much, but I don't expect to see a return from my investment. And most parents don't, at least a financial return. And that single factor has driven population in the developed world down to below 0 population growth. All of the increases in population are still coming from the developing world, and in our country from immigration. So population is going to peak on the planet probably at 9 billion if economic development takes place. The real challenge for sustainability is, will that economic development destroy the planet? If we have 9 or 10 billion people on the planet and we're still using one-time uses of resources and throwing them into a hole in the ground when we're done with them, we are in deep trouble. So we have to figure out a way to build an economy that isn't based on the one-time use of resources. So that's that's what I'd say to population.
We have a question in the front here.
Thank you. Stephen Bill, in one of your question responses, you spoke a lot about the role of energy technologies to address our economy's issues here. Now, when you delve further into the white papers, to the policy responses, the technologies that those trajectories are dependent upon, many of them don't exist at this point. One good example is carbon capture and storage, but that's only one of many examples. How do you reconcile this fact that we have a technological deficit with a shrinking federal budget on federal research into fundamental science and technologies?
Well, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but one of the major roles that we've identified for government is funding science in sustainability. So not only energy, but all types of sustainable technologies. It's a public-private partnership to develop these types of technologies. We've had this culture, or we've had this relationship for the last, almost a century. It's the relationship between public funding and then private commercialization of technologies that develop the internet, medical technologies, computers, laptops, cell phones. So we think that same transition will be needed to develop these advanced batteries, advanced solar technologies. So the government is doing this right now, but we think it needs to be increased significantly at the federal level to get us to where we need to go.
And we don't just say that there should be more federal money for science because we work at the largest research institute at Columbia that develops science. But in fact, it is that partnership between the basic research isn't going to be done by industry, has to be done by research universities and national labs with federal money. That's been the history of economic development in the United States. Pretty much everything has come from that, and we have to up that investment. And to do that, we need a functioning federal government, which I hope we'll get someday.
And other countries are doing that, by the way. So Korea has expanded dramatically its investment in R&D from the government side. Japan, China is increasing very rapidly. We do spend a lot, although it doesn't always show up. So it's in places like the Department of Defense. But we could do more. And if we spent the same percentage of our federal resources as Korea does, the amount of money that would go into research would increase dramatically. And if Korea can afford it, I think we should be able to afford it.
Thank you for your question. Up here? The microphone coming around. Yeah.
Thank you. So in New York City recently, the 80 by 50 goals have been announced. This would be a great target for the entire country. I know, as you mentioned, in Germany and other European countries, and Copenhagen and Brussels, there have been great strides made in energy policy. Could you spend a few moments talking to us about which of those strategies might be implementable in New York in order to meet the 80 by 50 goals, or even roll them out across the country? Thank you.
Well, I think when politicians set goals, far enough ahead that they're probably going to be retired, it's always a safe bet that they don't mean that much. But I think the real question, I think, is how do we move from here to there? So I think that there's a lot of things New York can do. I mean, New York City is already the most energy efficient place in the United States. And the state of California competes closely, but New York City does that, in part because of mass transit, because we live in smaller spaces and things of that sort. But what we could be doing, and what we need to do, is we need to make a transition from the fossil fuel-based economy to a different kind of economy. I don't know if you saw in the Wall Street Journal today, but a lot of the utilities are worried that the grid won't be able to pay for itself because people are reducing their energy use. And there could be no single more tangible piece of evidence that this transition is underway. So now we don't want the grid to collapse because we kind of need it, but that is another reason to have the government play a role in this transition. We need feed-in tariffs. We need a decentralized energy system. We need people being able to generate energy in their home with renewable sources. So the key is that kind of technological innovation. And people sometimes talk about it and say, well, will that ever happen? It doesn't exist now. As Bill said, we have some of those things in place now. We do need a couple of transformative technological innovations. I'd like to see smaller solar cells and cheaper ones. I'd like to see better battery technology. But it's not unimaginable, And I think that it's really about getting the best brains in the country working on these science and engineering problems and then bringing it to the private sector to commercialize. Al Gore took a lot of guff about him saying he invented the internet, but he did. He actually wrote the legislation to commercialize the internet, which had been a Defense Department project. He saw the commercial potential in that. So the internet, all of the web, comes from a Defense Department investment. So why can't we do this in energy? Why aren't we spending as much money as possible doing that? And then New York City, we're very good at buying new things here. So we would buy it. If the energy was cheaper and more reliable and more efficient than buying it off the grid, everybody would have it. So that's what I would do. That would get us to 95 by 50.
I also think, just to add to that, that there's activities that government can do to encourage adoption of technologies that already exist. So public procurement is one opportunity. I mean, the federal government, but government at all levels is one of the biggest purchasers of sustainable goods. In most developed countries, it's like 10% of GDP. So government can make policies to buy EVs, to buy clean energy, to retrofit their buildings. There's also property assessed clean energy, where people can borrow from local governments to make energy efficiency upgrades to their home, and the loan is tied to the house. So if people move, it stays with the house. So there's an incentive to make that upfront cost to get those building energy efficiency savings that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. New York State has a recent green bank, which is providing opportunities for private capital that companies wouldn't be able to access otherwise. So there's lots of activities that are happening that maybe smaller projects, not large investments in commercial activities, but that are helping kind of move the needle towards more energy efficiency and clean energy.
All good. At the back there.
Hi, thank you. My question is, what's your idea or vision of a cleaner or maybe better, a sustainable economy? Is there anything in the book about post-growth economy, like steady state or limits to growth for that matter?
Yeah. We talk a little bit about a different kind of consumption. I don't believe in the limits to growth. In fact, I read it in graduate school, and then immediately the Club of Rome put out Mankind at the Turning Point, which was the follow-up saying, well, we really can't do what we said in limits to growth. The model really didn't matter. The way I would put it is that the patterns of consumption have to change. So instead of driving round and round and round and round, and that's what our social activity is, maybe we walk somewhere, we cycle somewhere, we go to a cafe and talk to people instead of going to the mall and buying things. Those are still economic consumptions. Maybe we go to a university and take educational courses. Maybe we go online and take a massive online course. Those kinds of activities are still economic activities. They count in the GDP, but they're not resource consumptive. And then when we do have to consume resources, make sure they're renewable resources. Make sure that we're not just taking the thing and throwing it out after we're done with it. So if we combine those two strategies, a change in consumption. Another story that my students have heard too many times is I talk about when I went to college and I loaded up my trunk with all my records and books and my hi-fi and weighed the trunk down, and I had, a tenth maybe of the music and information that my daughter had when we took her to college with her iPod and her laptop. And that's a different kind of consumption, different kind of material base, but plenty of information and entertainment still on that more sustainable and less resource consumptive technology than all my vinyl records when I went to college. Everybody remembers what a vinyl record is. So I think we have to talk about a different style of consumption and a different way of life. If we say that sustainability is living a grim lifestyle alone in the dark with a candle, nobody's going to buy into it. We also can't do what they used to do. There's too many of us. I remember when Pete Seeger died. He lived on 150 acres on the Hudson. If everybody lived on 150 acres of the Hudson, there'd be no acres, there'd be no Hudson. We can't do that anymore. We can't. We're past the point we can get one with nature and live close to the land, at least most of us. Most of the world lives in cities. That's where sustainability is going to be found. We've got to figure out a way to do it. That's a lot of what we talk about in the book.
Excellent. Over here.
Yes. Where do you see your book fitting in with the implementation and execution of the Sustainable Development Goals that will be finally approved later this year?
Well, we didn't write the book with that in mind, but I think the book is written with, a global perspective. So most of the activities that we talk about are really local and state initiatives. There's some, we use examples from the international arena, but I think all of the policies that are in the book would align with the Sustainable Development Goals, but they weren't they weren't written with it in mind.
Speaking about global issues, can you explain sort of the divide between the rich and poor countries that has, with their development, they're still going through economic phases where they can't really afford the best technology out there? Does your book sort of address how to close that gap and help them leapfrog those stages?
I think we're seeing that already. I think if you look at China, for example, the opportunity to leapfrog dirty energy and go to clean energy not only impacts on the quality of the environment, but it also offers economic development opportunities, right? So I think you see China moving faster from the poor technologies or the dirty technologies to clean ones than we have in the developed world because of one, the lower cost, and two, the job development opportunities. So I actually see that as an optimistic perspective.
And one of the issues we do talk a little bit about is the need for government policy to facilitate technology transfer. Some of these technologies will diffuse on their own. Cell phones, for example, you don't need help for that. People who aren't on the grid in Africa have cell phones, and they recharge them at central stations. That technology has leapfrogged landlines, for example. But the real question is, can we do it for energy? And so if there's an energy technology that's developed that's cheaper and more convenient than what we've got now, that's going to facilitate economic development all over the world in a way that nothing else could. But it is a significant issue. The fact is that people desire that economic development. It's a huge political pressure on their regimes, and the regimes don't care about how they get the energy. That's why so much of the energy in the developing world right now is not clean. But I think a technological breakthrough coupled with policy to transfer technology and then marketing to transfer technology so that the private sector does it, can make that happen. And it's absolutely essential because, the climate problem in particular is created everywhere. And we could solve it here, do 80 by 50 New York, and still be under 6 feet of water at some point.
Over there.
So back to the home front, and you've made a few comments already about how we need a government that works. I guess my question is, it seems that the whole issue of climate change has become very politicized, and this has led to problems with getting the right funding and fear that basically our policy that's made right now will fall apart within 4 years or less. I guess the question is how. I'm not sure if it's addressed in the book, but how could we reach a depoliticization of this question, or otherwise consensus, and just move that off politics?
I don't know if you had a chance to see Sunday's Times about a business organization that's led by Michael Bloomberg, among others, but also Paulson, who was Treasury Secretary under Bush. And it's a national group of significant private sector leaders who have, in the process of issuing a series of reports about, one, the reality of climate change, the consequences, not just on air, but on food production and economic development, and the need to have a depoliticized discussion about what we need to do about the environment, clean energy, and a brighter future. It was a huge article. It was on the front page, I believe, of the business section. And I'm very hopeful that business can be a positive force. Also, there was an announcement earlier this year that Walmart is committed to providing 25% of all the energy used by their stores globally through solar energy by putting solar panels on all their businesses. So I think the business community can be a powerful force in coming between red and blue in this country, at least.
There's also some encouraging poll data that also came out over the weekend, a poll by the Times and Stanford University about climate denial, and that a majority of the country, including 48% of the Republicans now, accept the idea of climate change. They don't see it as a crisis, but they understand the nature of the issue and that it's a serious issue. So I think that the politicization of the environment has crested. We had a wonderful course here earlier this year that Alison had a lot to do with getting organized, where the people that wrote the original environmental laws in the United States, Tom Jorling and Leon Billings, were here talking about how in 1970, across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats worked together to pass that legislation because, everybody likes to breathe. It's one of those things that it doesn't matter what political party you're in. So I think that tendency is crested. It's not to say that it's over. It's not. But I think that people believe their senses, and I think they're beginning to understand this.
I'm going to sneak in one question here. Alison, for you. One chapter in the book is devoted entirely to sustainability metrics. Why is measurement so important?
Sure. We dedicate quite a bit of time talking to measurement because, as you probably have all heard, especially if you were a student at SEPA, you can't manage what you don't measure. So with the increasing reporting by corporations, we think that the government should be involved in determining what corporations should be measuring. Sustainability today is kind of defined pretty vaguely, so most organizations can decide what they want to measure, how they report it, and these things tend to change over time and between companies and industries. So it's hard to compare the sustainability of different organizations, and it's really hard to compare over time. So we think that if you're trying to measure sustainability and you're trying to make improvements, you need to know what you're measuring. So we're hopeful that the government will take a role in determining kind of what are the indicators that an organization should be measuring regarding sustainability. We think it should be led by the Department of Commerce and involve a lot of different public agencies as well as stakeholders from the private sector who are engaged in this industry, as well as academia. So we're hopeful that that's an activity that we'll be picking up.
And I think I'm old enough to remember when New York City was nearly bankrupt, and typically governments around the country did their accounting similarly to the way we measure sustainability these days. Everybody had their own way of measuring and moved money. New York City famously was paying for salaries and everything else out of the capital budget, borrowing over time and ultimately. So what happened was, particularly with pressure from the private sector, GAAP, or generally accepted accounting principles, became a standard for all state and local governments around the country, so that you could look at any state or local budget and see whether or not it was in balance and see whether their practices were legitimate. And I think what we're arguing is the same thing needs to happen with sustainability. And the more and more we create pressure from places like academia, among experts and sympathetic people, I believe that over the next 10 or 20 years, sustainability management will just be part of performance measures that any business, any nonprofit, any university, any government needs to present in public to show that they're well managed. You can't be well managed if you're not using sustainability as a guide.
And what Bill talks about happening in the government in the 70s is actually what happened to the private sector in the 30s. One of the causes of the crash of '29 was that corporations were able to report whatever they wanted to. There were no generally accepted accounting practices. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, worked throughout the 1930s to establish that, so that every corporation would have to use the same standards. In the 20s, if you invested in the stock market, it was like going to Atlantic City. It was basically gambling. And so you didn't really know what you were buying. Now you do know what you're buying because it's regulated. The problem with sustainability right now is, in fact, it's the Wild West. Every corporation gets to present whatever they want to. Every government gets to present what they want to. And Alison is part of a research project, and I see Dong Gua back there is another one of our members of our research project. And our goal was to see how is sustainability measured around the world. We came up with 800 different measures and about, a dozen different indices that are being used. Every one of them different. Different NGOs competing with other NGOs for their being the better measurement. And that's what calls out for government, particularly the United States government, but we're hoping maybe US and China can do this together, come up with some baseline sustainability measures. And that's a really important part of the role of government, is somebody has to be the referee. If you don't know where the goalposts are, how do you know what a touchdown is?
Excellent. Question at the back there?
Hi, thank you. To bring it back to New York, I'm wondering if you can comment on, Mayor Bloomberg was a pretty strong champion of sustainability, and de Blasio is 1 year into his term. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the change, the degree to which sustainability is valued, and in terms of investing resources and time and people and et cetera, with the new administration?
We'll see. Actually, our colleague from Columbia, Nilda Mesa, who ran sustainability here at Columbia, has just been put in charge of that for the city. I attended a session where a bunch of city agencies were sitting together trying to figure out what this meant. It clearly wasn't the highest priority in the first year for the new administration, but our hope is that it will become the highest priority. It wasn't the highest priority for Mike Bloomberg when he started either.
But it did, and to his credit, I think he's helped make New York famous for its commitment to sustainability and for responsible environmental practices. Politics is politics, right? So it's really hard for a new mayor then to just embrace what was a signature item for the previous administration. So there is some politics involved, but I think if you look at Bill de Blasio's history, this was an issue that he was always supportive of in the past. So I think there's a little transition too. So he had his signature of pre-K. I guess it was today, right, or yesterday, announced housing for his second we're very hopeful that sustainability will be the centerpiece of year 3.
And I'll just one comment on that. It's one of the things that I think Mayor Bloomberg got right was institutionalizing the plan and the office into law, and I think that will help the transition as de Blasio ratchets up, his own priorities in the area.
There's a question up front here.
Thank you very much. Following up on the earlier question, and I really look forward to reading this book. I wonder if you could comment on the trend that corporations have had in naming a chief sustainability officer. So I know Walmart did that about 5 years ago, and now we see this broad goal and this real commitment. So is that a leading indicator that it's a serious issue and one of those inflection points in our economy?
I think it's a phase, and it's an important one. Ultimately, we want it to be invisible. So I compare this to the people in 1999 that were the head of the international desk. And now, of course, every desk's an international desk. And so, yes, you need to have a separate operation to focus on that. Eventually, it should be integrated into management. But right now, it's not. And so you actually need an in-house person. Now, it could turn out like information management, where you have a CIO, and that just becomes an ongoing function. I don't know how this will develop organizationally, but eventually the goal is for it to be integrated. It can't be something off to the side or special or distinct. It has to be, this is just part of management, what Bill was saying before.
Mm-hmm. I also think that, and we tell our students this a lot, that just because the title isn't sustainability officer or sustainability analyst doesn't mean that that role isn't there. So it may just be titled something else, but I think the growth in the consideration of these activities is evident across organizations. So I think that's just one way that we're seeing it.
I think it is a two-stage process. So, for example, I've spent 4 years as Deputy Fire Commissioner. Huge amounts of energy used by the emergency services. I can tell you, it was never on anybody's mind. No one thought, geez, we have all this equipment, we do 1.5 million runs. Isn't there a way that we could do that more? It wasn't even on the chart. So I think to start to penetrate some of the public safety agencies, for example, you would need, I think, an officer who would have that as the role. But I agree with Steve, ultimately for it to succeed, that has to become the way management thinks. So when you're buying a new fire truck, you ask the question, so what does it run on? How much energy does it use? Is there a way to do that better?
There are other questions from the audience? Right here.
Hi. I was wondering if we could kind of take the discussion back to the foundations of the fossil fuel industry. Because I always talk about sustainability and all these things that we can do, and we've been talking about it for quite some time. But we all know that there's a lot of money that's hardwired into the fossil fuel industry in the US and in other large companies, countries and companies and corporations. What do you think are 3 major policies that would need to change in order to shift that mindset and money and all the people that are hardwired into that money to get them to come to the other side? What do you really think needs to happen?
So, the people that built the landlines were called AT&T. And this cell phone, it says in the corner, AT&T. So those guys were smart enough to get into the cell phone business. And most people in their homes now don't have landlines, they have cell phones. So, for the life of me, I can't figure out why these companies don't get into these alternative energies. But if they don't, somebody will beat them, okay? There will be other companies that will get the technologies and use them and, in essence, underprice the fossil fuel business. You're right, there is enormous power, enormous infrastructure, and they're trying, a mark of their desperation is how much they're spending on political lobbying. I think they know that the tide is going to move against them. And so I think it's a losing battle for them. If I were in the fossil fuel business, which I'm not, I would be trying to get out of it. I think someday people are going to look back and say, you burned that stuff? You mean you didn't use it for plastics? You didn't use it for other kinds of manufacturing? Were you people crazy? So I do think that, but I think the way for this is to get the science and technology ramped up to beat them so that you can buy cheaper stuff elsewhere. You won't need them anymore, and better stuff.
But also, it's where government, I think, plays a gigantic role, right? So government policies, and then look at Germany. I mean, so why is Germany different? Why is Germany so emphasizing on clean energy? Are oil companies less powerful in Germany, or is it that the government and the people are more forward-looking, I mean, I don't know exactly the answer to that, but I do know that's a reality. I also know, looking at my neighbors and my friends, when government gives them incentives to move toward geothermal or solar power, and the incentives get enough, people do it, and once they do it, you're starting to make progress. So I think you attack it not head on. Let's make this a war between fossil. No, I'm not saying you're saying that, but I think it's small battles and changing the economic dynamic. I think that's really what it is. I also think, by the way, if you look at, there's a generational factor here too. I've been here long enough to see different classes of students come in, and I think there's a much more fundamental commitment to environmental sustainability among the next generation of leaders. And so the more people that are in positions of power who are committed to that, the higher the probability I think that becomes the norm.
We'll have one more question from the floor over here, and then certainly the authors will be available afterwards at the reception. Oh, could you just wait for the microphone, please?
So you mentioned the agreement between the United States and China in the conversation. What weight do you think that will carry in the Paris talks, and what implications do you think that will have on domestic policy?
Well, I'm afraid I consider the international diplomacy to be a waste of time. You've probably heard me say that before. They're nice for educational purposes, and I understand the parties are good. But there's too much of a fundamental gap between the different countries for that to work. But I do think that the agreement with China is very significant. And I think China is moving off of coal, not because of the United States and Obama's visit, but because if you go to Beijing, you can't breathe. And the elite in that country know they have to start this transition. So I think the international discussions are helpful in that they raise consciousness, they increase the legitimacy of these kinds of policies, making it easier for national leaders to do this kind of thing. But I don't see, much happening in Paris. I didn't see much happen in Copenhagen. I don't see much happen in any of these places. And I think the action is elsewhere. Not to say that these things are a waste of time, but they command a lot more attention than they deserve, in my view. But I'm not a majority view on this. Most of my colleagues in the Earth Institute think I'm wrong. But I'm one of the few political scientists in the Earth Institute, so that may be one of the reasons.
I'll also just add, I think that Obama's climate plan through the Clean Air Act is probably more influential on international agreements than a bi-country agreement with China. I think that showing the international arena that the U.S. is moving forward with these plans, regardless of what Congress is doing, shows that we are taking steps and we are serious about it. So I think that will be influential in Paris as well.
So that ends the Q&A portion of the evening. The book, Sustainability Policy, Hastening the Transition to a Cleaner Economy. There are copies available in the front. I hope you'll all join me in thanking and congratulating our esteemed authors on their publication.